Release the Kraken. But does your world have a Kraken? What kind of animals do inhabit your ocean sphere? Do you have monsters, interesting critters, things for people to explore? That is what I'd like to talk about today, creating undersea creatures in a fantasy world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host Marie Mullany. If you'd like to support me in making more of these videos, you can hit my Ko-fi page in the link down below, where I have memberships and one-off donations available, or you can buy my books available on Amazon, linked to my profile in the description. Okay, let's get cracking. When you're creating an undersea creature, there's a couple of really fundamental questions. The first is it amphibian or is it purely sea-based? The turtle, as an example, does have amphibious capabilities. So does the seal and the otter. These creatures, generally speaking, are not good on land, but they are capable of being on land. And that does provide them with certain opportunities. For example, the seal can escape from its predators by coming up onto land. The turtle lays its eggs on the beach. These things offer certain evolutionary advantages to those creatures. So consider whether you want your creatures to be capable of coming onto land or not. The second important question that you're going to want to answer is this a nomadic creature or is it a reef-based creature? So here what you want to think about is things like the blue whales and the sharks and the sardines and creatures like that travel the ocean currents. And they move from place to place. Versus, say, seahorses or wrasses or parrotfish, creatures that reside on a reef complex. The real difference here is one of size and food type. Reef-based fishes, while they are your fundamental nursery of the sea, tend to be smaller creatures than your true leviathans. And speaking of leviathans, the shape of your creature is quite an interesting question. The ocean exists with depth as well as the landscape, and that makes some differences to the shape of your creatures. Not only do your creatures need to be capable of moving through water with minimal interference, so they need to be fairly streamlined, but they also have a somewhat bulkier shape than their land-based counterparts because they don't have the same growth restrictions on them as a land-based dweller does. So when you're doing your shape of your creatures, don't feel that you have to be restricted to kind of the classic fish shape. I mean, squid move through the water perfectly fine and they're pretty big. So do sunfish. There's a creature in the ocean called a pyrosoma that's basically like multiple cellular organisms that forms like this huge tube. When I saw it the first time, I thought I was seeing a plastic, and it turned out to be this creature forming this tube that shines when you shine your torch on it. It comes up in all kinds of colors. It's amazing. So think wild thoughts when you're doing your actual shape and size and physiology. But what Under the Sea really gives you is an opportunity to lean into some strange abilities. Under the sea creatures really abound with strange abilities, even in our world. So you can take those abilities and make a creature that combines some of those elements and maybe includes some magic of your world. So give this video a thumbs up and let's talk a little bit about the really strange abilities of creatures under the sea. There are creatures who live so deep that they wouldn't have light if they didn't make their own light. Famously, of course, Finding Nemo showed us the lanternfish that uses its light to lure other fish to it so that it can eat them. So you can make creatures that have bioluminescence. You could make creatures that use magic to make their lights. Those creatures could become part of an undersea civilization's domesticated creatures in order to provide light for undersea cities so that you avoid the need for fire. But light is only one of the things that is strange about under the sea. There are creatures who can generate electricity. The electric eel has got special organs that allow it to create two voltages of electricity. The first is a deadly attack with which it stuns its prey. I say deadly, but it's not always deadly, but it does stun its prey and control it. The second is a lighter voltage that allows the electric eel to use something called electrolocation, by which it tells where an object is through electricity, through its electrical impulses and how it interacts with the eel's electrical aura. You could lean into that and have creatures that generate electricity, and that electricity could again be a domesticated creature that powers your undersea cities, giving you access to electricity without the need for, say, the internal combustion engine or other fire-driven activities like a steam engine. So think about whether you have creatures that have strong enough electrics, either in a group or separately, to generate that kind of power. I mean, there is one species of electric eel that actually hunts in a pack. Like, it groups the fish together using their electricity, and then they attack the fish in a bunch, and they all feast on the fish that they've herded together like this. So you've got quite a lot of options to use with such an animal that has that kind of electricity control. Then let's talk about the sea slug and genetic theft. Not joking. There is a sea slug called Elysia chlorictia. Name on the whiteboard in case I'm pronouncing that terribly wrong. And that has an ability that hasn't been found anywhere else. So this sea slug eats algae, right? And algae is obviously a plant. Plants photosynthesize. You know what the sea slug can do? It can photosynthesize. Why? Because it has eaten the algae and taken their photosynthesis receptors into itself. It can literally use those organella and photosynthesize for itself and survive that way. Even more, it's actually adopted and incorporated the DNA of that algae into itself, and it can now produce its own photosynthesis organellas. I mean, that is amazingly cool. And you can incorporate that into the magic system of your world. What if the magic system of your world was based on something like this, where your mages basically take a creature's abilities, its physical abilities, and incorporate them. So if they want to go underwater, they take a fish and they adopt its gills. And then if they want to go back onto land, they discard those. Or maybe they're even capable of integrating DNA into their own DNA, and your mages are these weird creatures with like all kinds of crazy DNA that they potentially pass on to their children and that they just go nuts with. I think that would be such a cool magic system, to have mages that just incorporate DNA based on the sea slug ability. So from sea slugs to sea cucumbers, the sea cucumber can turn itself into liquid goo. It can literally let go of its cells, like break the bonds between its cells, turn into goo, move in between narrow spaces, and then re-solidify. If it does that for too long, it obviously dies from turning into a liquid, from liquefying itself. But it can do this as a defensive mechanism to get into small spaces. So once again, you can lean into that in a magic system, allowing your creatures to debond themselves and reform as you need them to. And that could be an ability that they get from this sea cucumber, especially if you go with that DNA idea. They incorporate some cucumber DNA and suddenly they're all liquid in all the right places. Under the sea, you also sometimes need weapons. Now remember when I spoke about the crab that uses a fire anemone and puts it on its hat and wears the fire anemone as a protection? Yeah, I'm starting to feel like anemones are just like the bicycle of the sea, or at least of the crabs, because there is the white-furred crab that uses fire anemones as weapons. So it picks up fire anemones in its claws, or it picks up anemones in its claws, and then it uses their abilities as a means to defend itself against other creatures. And it's not just a case of it randomly picks them up. It knows how to hold the anemone so that it does maximum damage with the anemone. What's more is it'll use those anemones as food as well. So it'll reach into their digestive system and extract anything that they've caught and eat it on the fly. It's just so freaking cool. So that could also be something you lean into, where you have these crab overlords that, are oppressing your anemone people. Rise up, anemone people, and overthrow the crab overlords while moving really slowly, because, anemones do that. Anyway, I think it's an amazing potential for a story or a magic system or just a piece of flavor for your world to have a creature that uses anemones as a weapon. Of course, water does offer you some other things as well. Famously, Cthulhu was imprisoned underwater, and that imprisoning underwater is actually quite a common trope in fantasy world. So if you've got a very special, unique monster that you want to keep imprisoned, putting it underwater certainly has an element of the classics going on, and then having people, dive down and raise the great Cthulhu has the gravitas of fantastical history behind it. I think one of the things that is often neglected about undersea creatures is that they can change dramatically between juveniles and adults. For example, the emperor angelfish looks quite different when it is a juvenile to when it's an adult. You might want to think about how different creatures are when they're a juvenile versus when they're an adult in an undersea environment. And then the last thing that I briefly want to mention about undersea creatures is the potential for mangroves. Now, mangroves is an environment that really deserves its own video because they are just amazingly rich in life. But with a mangrove, you can really mix your animals, your undersea creatures, as well as your hybrid amphibians, and have a wealth of life available to you. And you can use that life in your magic system to fuel your magic system in many ways, either by directly drawing on the life or by drawing on strange growth that are only available in mangroves or strange creatures that are only available in mangroves. So if you'd like to know more about mangroves, if you'd like me to do a video on it, comment down below. And otherwise, give this video a thumbs up. Maybe check out my video on how to make an island. And if you'd like to connect with me or other like-minded world builders, I do have a Discord server. And I will see you soon for another video of Just in Time Worlds.